Welcome to this new adventure, where the shadows of the night reveal their darkest secrets. This story I'm about to tell you today might forever change the way you see forests. Stay alert because every detail matters, and believe me, you won't want to miss the final revelation that will freeze your blood. Thomas Beaumont was a 42-year-old man who worked as a forest ranger in the Vosges region for more than 15 years. He knew every trail, every tree, every corner of this vast wooded expanse that stretched across thousands of hectares. His duty cabin was located in the very heart of the forest, several kilometers from the first village accessible by a paved road. This isolation had never bothered him. On the contrary, he found deep peace in the silence of the woods and the birds' songs. But this tranquility was about to transform into a nightmare he would never forget. The story begins on a Tuesday evening in October, when the leaves had taken their autumn colors and carpeted the ground with a golden blanket. Thomas had just finished his usual rounds and was preparing to return to his cabin to prepare his dinner. The sun was declining rapidly behind the treetops, casting long and disturbing shadows on the forest path. That's when he heard for the first time this strange noise that would haunt his nights for weeks. A deep and prolonged sound, like a moan that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. At first, Thomas thought it might be an injured animal, a deer or wild boar that could have been caught in a poacher's trap. He decided to follow the sound to bring help to the creature in distress. Armed with his flashlight and first aid kit, he ventured into the undergrowth in the direction of the mysterious noise. The deeper he went, the more the moan seemed to intensify, echoing between the tree trunks like a distorted echo. Branches crackled under his steps, and the growing darkness made his progress increasingly difficult. After about 20 minutes of walking, Thomas arrived in a clearing he had never noticed before. In the center of this open space stood a circle of stones, ancient ones, covered with moss and carved with strange symbols. The moan now seemed to come directly from this mysterious circle. Thomas approached cautiously, directing his flashlight toward the carved stones. The symbols were of ancient craftsmanship, reminiscent of Celtic runes he had seen in history books. Suddenly, the noise stopped abruptly, plunging the forest into absolute silence. Even the nocturnal insects seemed to have ceased their usual concert. This total absence of sound was more terrifying than the moan itself. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine and decided it was time to return. But when he tried to turn back, he realized with horror that he no longer recognized the path by which he had arrived. All the trails looked the same in the darkness, and his flashlight was beginning to...
He tried to find his footprints, but the forest floor was too hard and covered with dead leaves. Panic was beginning to take hold of him when he heard a new sound. This time, it wasn't a moan, but rather like footsteps slowly approaching. Heavy and irregular steps, as if something massive was moving between the trees. Thomas turned off his flashlight and hid behind a large oak, holding his breath. The footsteps approached inexorably, now accompanied by rough and jerky breathing. In the moonlight filtering through the branches, Thomas glimpsed an immense silhouette heading toward the clearing. The creature measured at least 10 feet tall and walked on two legs, but its gait was nothing human. Its body was covered with dark fur, and its arms hung down to the ground like those of a large ape. But what terrified Thomas most were its eyes that glowed with a red light in the darkness. The creature stopped in the center of the stone circle and raised its head toward the night sky. It then let out a howl so powerful the birds flew from all the surrounding trees. Thomas pressed his hands to his ears to protect himself from this piercing cry that seemed to resonate throughout his body. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature disappeared into the darkness of the forest. Thomas waited long minutes before daring to move. Then he turned on his flashlight and ran in the opposite direction.
He had to walk for more than 2 hours before finding a familiar trail that led him back to his cabin. Once safe, he carefully locked his door and all his windows before collapsing in his armchair. It was now near midnight and Thomas was exhausted, but he knew he couldn't sleep. He prepared strong coffee and settled near his window to watch the forest's edge. All night he watched for the slightest suspicious movement between the trees, but nothing came to disturb the apparent calm. In the early morning, Thomas told himself he might have been victim of a hallucination caused by fatigue and stress. After all, he had been working a lot lately and sleeping poorly because of poachers operating in the region. He decided not to tell anyone about this experience and continue his work as if nothing had happened. But in the following days, other strange incidents began occurring in the forest. Hikers reported hearing terrifying howls during their daytime excursions. Several campers were found in a state of shock, unable to explain what had happened to them. Their tents were slashed and their belongings scattered, as if after the passage of a rabid animal. Thomas began receiving more and more reports concerning these mysterious incidents. Local authorities asked him to investigate, but he didn't know where to start. He returned several times to the stone clearing, but found no trace of the creature he had seen. However, he noticed that the forest animals seemed to avoid this area. No birds sang in the surrounding trees, no squirrels climbed the trunks. Even the insects seemed to flee this cursed place. Thomas decided to research the history of this clearing in the region's archives. He discovered that this place was mentioned in several local legends dating back to the Middle Ages. The inhabitants of that time spoke of a forest demon that terrorized imprudent travelers. According to these accounts, the creature was the guardian of an ancient pagan sanctuary dedicated to forgotten deities. The carved stones would be the remains of this ancestral temple, and anyone who dared to desecrate them suffered the demon's wrath. Thomas also learned that several mysterious disappearances had occurred in this forest over the centuries. Lumberjacks, hunters, mushroom pickers who had gone into the woods and never returned. Their bodies had never been found, despite numerous searches organized by authorities. These discoveries only increased Thomas's anxiety, who was beginning to regret accepting this isolated position. But his financial situation didn't allow him to resign, and he had to continue ensuring the forest's surveillance. He took some additional precautions, however, avoiding going out after sunset, and always carrying a rifle during his rounds. One evening in late October, Thomas was dining when he heard knocks at his door. He looked through the window but saw no one on his cabin's threshold. The knocks resumed, more insistent this time, echoing in the night's silence. Thomas took his rifle and approached the door cautiously without opening it. "Who could be coming here at this hour?" he asked in a loud voice. Only silence answered him. Then he heard the sound of footsteps slowly moving away. He waited several minutes before slightly opening the door and glancing outside. No one in sight, but on the ground in front of his cabin, he discovered gigantic footprints. These tracks measured at least 16 inches long and sank deep into the soft earth. They led directly toward the forest, disappearing between the first trees. Thomas quickly closed the door and pushed all the locks. He spent the rest of the night sitting in his armchair, rifle on his knees, watching for the slightest suspicious noise. In the morning, he examined the footprints again in daylight. They were even more impressive than he had thought, with claws marked in the earth. Thomas took photos and casts of these tracks before they could be erased by rain. He sent this evidence to a biologist friend who worked at the Natural History Museum. The response he received a few days later only increased his concern. His friend wrote that these prints didn't correspond to any animal species known in the region. They presented characteristics that were both human and animal, but of a totally abnormal size. The biologist suggested it might be a hoax or deception, but Thomas knew well that wasn't the case. He had seen with his own eyes. In the following weeks, incidents multiplied in the forest. Several cars were found abandoned on forest roads, their occupants having disappeared without leaving traces. The gendarmes intensified their patrols, but found no clues about the fate of the missing. Thomas was increasingly solicited to accompany search teams, but he systematically refused to venture into the forest after nightfall. He made excuses about health problems or administrative obligations to avoid these night missions. One day, the mayor of the nearest village came to visit him to discuss the situation. "Mr. Beaumont," he said, "the inhabitants are beginning to fear coming into the forest. The region's tourism suffers from it, and we absolutely must find an explanation for all these strange events." Thomas didn't know what to answer without appearing as a madman. He couldn't very well tell the mayor he had seen a 10-foot demon in the woods. He promised to redouble his vigilance and intensify his daytime patrols. But deep down, he knew these measures would be useless against the creature he had glimpsed. That night, Thomas had a particularly disturbing dream. He saw himself walking in the forest in the middle of the night, guided by an invisible force toward the stone clearing. Arriving there, he discovered that the circle was surrounded by dozens of motionless people. Approaching, he realized with horror that they were all the missing from recent weeks. They stood, eyes empty, turned toward the circle's center where the gigantic creature stood. The latter looked at him fixedly and spoke to him in a language he didn't understand. Yet the meaning of its words was clear in his mind. He had to join the others and serve the forest guardian. Thomas woke with a start, drenched in sweat and heart pounding. It was 4 in the morning, and the forest's silence seemed more oppressive than ever. He got up to prepare coffee and try to chase away the images of his nightmare. But when he looked through his kitchen window, he almost dropped his cup. In the clearing that stretched in front of his cabin, there were dozens of motionless silhouettes. Men, women, children, all standing in the grass, perfectly static. Thomas blinked, thinking he was still dreaming, but when he reopened his eyelids, the silhouettes were still there. He ran to get his binoculars and carefully scrutinized the clearing. What he saw chilled him with horror. They were indeed people, but their faces were of cadaverous pallor. Their eyes were completely white, and they all stared at his cabin with empty gazes. Thomas recognized among them several of the recent missing, notably a German couple of hikers who had been reported missing the previous week. He wanted to call the gendarmes, but his phone had no signal. His cabin's landline was also cut. He was completely isolated with these creatures that seemed... Thomas verified that all his doors and windows were properly locked. Then he armed himself with his rifle. He waited like this until sunrise, but the silhouettes didn't move a millimeter. With the first rays of sun, they slowly began to disappear, like shadows that fade. In a few minutes, the clearing had become completely deserted again. Thomas cautiously left his cabin to examine the place where the apparitions had been. He found no trace of their passage, not even a footprint in the grass wet with dew. That's when he made the decision to definitively leave his position and flee this cursed forest. He began gathering his most important belongings, keeping only the essentials. But when he tried to get his car out of the garage, he discovered that all his tires had been slashed. The cuts were clean and deep, as if someone had used very sharp blades. His car was immobilized, and he had no way to contact the outside. Thomas realized he was prisoner of this forest and its supernatural inhabitants. He returned to his cabin and barricaded the door with all the furniture he could move. Then, he settled near a window with his rifle, determined to resist to the end. The day passed relatively calmly, but as soon as night fell, events accelerated. The knocks on the door resumed. But this time they came from all directions. Hands seemed to be drumming against the cabin's walls, looking for a way to enter. Thomas heard scratching on the roof, as if something was trying to tear off the tiles. He fired shots through the wooden partitions, but this seemed to have no effect. The noises continued, more and more intense, more and more pressing. Suddenly, all the cabin's windows exploded simultaneously. Glass shards flew in all directions, and Thomas had to protect his face with his arms. Through the gaping openings, dozens of pale hands began entering the cabin. Thomas emptied his rifle's magazine on these arms that were waving, but they continued advancing as if they didn't feel the bullets. The creatures began penetrating the cabin through the broken windows. They were indeed the missing he had seen in the clearing, but their appearance was even more frightening up close. Their skin was of a sickly white, and their completely rolled back eyes showed only white. They advanced toward him with jerky gait, arms extended like sleepwalkers. Thomas retreated toward the fireplace and seized a poker to defend himself. The first assailant who came within his reach received a violent blow to the head. The poker went through the creature's skull without meeting resistance, as if it were made of fog. Yet it continued advancing, imperturbable. Thomas understood he couldn't fight these beings with conventional weapons. He headed toward his cabin's back door, the one that led directly to the forest. He moved aside the furniture, blocking it, and opened it wide. Outside, the night was of absolute black, with no visible moon or stars. Thomas rushed into the darkness, running blindly between the trees. Behind him, he heard the creatures leaving the cabin and launching into pursuit. Their footsteps echoed on the forest floor, more and more numerous, more and more close. Thomas ran without stopping, stumbling on roots and stones, scratching himself on low branches. He had no idea which direction he was taking. He was just fleeing straight ahead. After what seemed like an eternity, he arrived in the new clearing. But this one was different from the one with carved stones. In the center stood an enormous centennial oak, whose trunk was so wide it would have taken 10 people to circle it. The tree emanated a strange aura, almost luminous in the darkness. Thomas approached the plant giant and placed his hand on its rough bark. Immediately, he felt a sensation of peace and protection he hadn't experienced for weeks. The pursuit noises had stopped at the clearing's edge. Thomas turned around and saw that the pale creatures had gathered in a circle around the clearing. But they didn't dare enter it, as if an invisible barrier prevented them. They remained there, motionless, staring at him with their white eyes. Thomas understood he was protected as long as he stayed near the great oak. He leaned against the trunk and waited, observing his pursuers who maintained silent guard. Hours passed slowly, and Thomas began to doze despite the situation. That's when he heard a voice that seemed to come from the tree itself. "Don't be afraid," said the voice. "I am the true guardian of this forest." Thomas startled and looked around, but there was no one else in the clearing. The voice resumed, clearer this time. "The one you saw is only a usurper, a demon that settled in the old temple's ruins. He corrupts the souls of the dead and living to increase his power." Thomas couldn't believe his ears. "Who are you?" he asked in a low voice. "I am this forest's spirit, the one who has protected it for millennia. But my forces are diminishing against this demon who gains power. I need an ally among the living to stop him definitively." Thomas realized this was why he had been guided to this clearing. "What must I do?" he asked. "You must destroy the stone circle that serves as the demon's anchor in our world. But beware, he won't let it happen easily." The tree spirit explained that he had to return to the cursed clearing before dawn. It's the moment when the demon's powers are weakest. He should overturn each of the carved stones and break them with an iron object. Iron was one of the few materials capable of affecting supernatural creatures. Thomas thought back to the poker he had left in his cabin. He would therefore have to return to get it before going to the stone clearing. Thomas left the protected clearing and headed toward his abandoned cabin. The pale creatures didn't follow him this time, as if they had received another order. He found his cabin in a deplorable state, with all furniture overturned and belongings scattered. But the poker was still near the fireplace, intact. Thomas seized it firmly and headed toward the stone clearing. The path seemed shorter this time, as if the forest itself was guiding him. When he came within sight of the circle, he saw that the demonic creature was there, motionless in the center. It seemed to be sleeping, or rather meditating, drawing from the place's dark energies. Thomas silently approached the first stone. It was heavier than he had imagined, but he managed to make it topple. The noise of its fall echoed in the clearing, and the creature opened its red eyes. It let out a roar of anger, seeing Thomas attacking its sanctuary. But it couldn't move immediately, as if it were still numb. Thomas took advantage of this respite to overturn a second stone, then a third. With each stone that fell, the creature seemed to lose substance. It became more transparent, less threatening, but it was also beginning to recover its strength and was heading toward him with heavy steps. Thomas ran toward the fourth stone and pushed it with all his strength. The creature reached him just as he was raising the poker to strike. It tried to seize him with its claws, but its hand passed through Thomas's body without touching him. The tree spirit's protection was still working. Thomas brought down the poker on the carved stone, which split in two. A flash of green light burst from the crack, and the creature howled in pain. There were still 3 stones to destroy, but Thomas felt the protection beginning to weaken. The creature's claws now grazed his skin without piercing it. He rushed toward the 5th stone and made it fall with a shoulder blow. The creature was now almost transparent, but it was also becoming faster and more desperate. Thomas broke the 5th stone with his poker and ran toward the 6th. But this time, the creature was faster than him. Its claws sank into Thomas's back, tearing his shirt and skin. The pain was atrocious, but Thomas managed to escape and make the 6th stone fall. Only 1 stone remained, the largest, the one in the circle's center. But the creature stood before him, immense and terrifying despite its transparency. Thomas knew he would only have 1 attempt. If he failed, he would end up like all the other forest, missing. He took his run-up and charged toward the last stone, poker raised above his head. The creature threw itself at him at the same moment, all claws out. The shock was terrible. Thomas felt the claws lacerate his chest and arms, but his momentum carried him to the central stone, which he struck with all his strength. The poker broke under impact, but the stone exploded into 1,000 pieces. A blinding light filled the clearing, and the creature let out a final howl. Then everything became silent again. Thomas lay on the ground, wounded but alive. Around him, the circle's stones were nothing but dust and rubble. The demonic creature had completely disappeared. He then heard human voices calling him in the distance. They were the gendarmes who had been searching for him since they discovered his abandoned cabin. All the missing were found in the following days.